It's on the scientists to communicate with the public and not the public to learn how to speak science. That's why kids, are excited about seeing a volcano. It's the spark of it. So how do we bring that back? You develop these safety pathways, and eventually they can become stronger than the fear. What we want is a scientifically literate society. When they go to their physician and ask a question, they feel like they can. Here's how it might cost more money if we don't fix it. We're enabling students to be mobile. You go to a different country. You learn a different country's system. I think is very, important to widen the circle of who is a scientist, because I think anybody could be. Just because you have high stress susceptibility doesn't mean that your resiliency is super low. This enhances employability. It enhances these very particular soft skills. It's letting people know that it's normal. Experience it. You're going to be uncomfortable for a bit, but you'll come out more resilient in the end.
Dan Pace here from Genuine Technologies with another Getting Started episode, exploring some things that happen in your brain while getting started. So I'm really excited to be joined by a longtime friend of mine. I'll catch up with you from going back to the undergrad days with Dr. Kristin Anderson, calling me from Ireland at the University of Galway. So got a nice big 5 hour gap between us. Now, Kristen has some experience getting started with a few new things over her career. She's gotten several published peer-reviewed papers, which I think we'll definitely dig into a little bit on this episode. Done lobbying for funding research in the sciences in DC, some work in Ireland as well with their national food safety programs, along with newly lots of work in education, where you're now working with the Erasmus program for your university. So kind of want to start with, going back to maybe when you were doing your PhD, your doctorate, your research, things like that. Did you expect your career path in neuroscience to have gone through so many different twists and turns the way it has? Or was this more planned, where your career's gone?
Well, first, thank you for having me. So, no, my career has taken so many turns. And as you said, I have really started over so many times. Every time I switched careers, I moved, once even moving to a whole new continent and country. And a lot of it has been just because of events that occurred in my life where I had to make a switch and change to a new career. So I had to learn a lot about what skills did you gain in schooling and in different careers and through experiences that could be applied to a new role, and really grow in how can I be resilient through all of these changes. That can be really overwhelming at times. So as you said, yeah, I never imagined I thought I would be in the lab forever. So I never imagined that I would be switching into various roles, whether it be in politics or in helping develop international strategies.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the whole getting started thing. I was actually going to ask, did it feel like getting something started new each and every time, or was it kind of a more continuation of, I'm still doing neuroscience at the core of it, or I'm still in science maybe at the core of it, but just in different ways? Sounds like you really had a whole new, spin of things several times over. But definitely want to dig into the politics part because, that's definitely one of the furthest reaches from like, on the one side doing, the research to now you just have to maybe talk about it and show the results, but you don't get to do anything hands on for the most part. I mean, how was that for the switch from the lab to being in front of people, shaking hands where you're not in the lab to say the least?
Well, it's fun to use scientific method, the ability to read literature, talk about things, be very complex things based in huge amounts of data, but it is about how you convey it, which is what scientists do every day. They take huge amounts of experiments and they have to distill it into a paper, into an abstract. So you have to know what are the pertinent things you need to tell somebody. And that's really similar to politics. It's just a different language. So I feel like a lot of times you can use the same skills. You just have to learn the language of now policy. So, but it's a lot of the same skills as, trying to figure out what does the literature say about a particular problem? What are the evidence-based ways to solve or address a particular issue? And then how do you take all of that, vast literature and make it into a one pager for policy? So it really just comes down to your ability to take a lot of information and distill it down to what's important. And I think the critical step that's different, where in a lot of science publications, you're showing what you did. And there's a part where you're talking about what the next steps are. And science is always about the next thing. But a lot of times communication is just showing the results that have been done. And that works well for that mode of communication. But policy is a lot of what's the action from this. We might not necessarily care about all of the research that went behind it. Great. it happened. We know there was, vast amounts of data and really smart people, working on this that are really good at what they do. But we want to know, what do you take from this and what do you do with it? So it's just another, in that sense, as you said, it's another step. So it's not completely different. It's just talking about it, kind of translating it into a different language, and then saying, well, what can we do about this? And a lot of the policy, I think, the policy world is the real world where there's multiple things happening at one time. And so it's very different from the lab where you kind of have a controlled system and you can control all of the factors for the most part in a particular experiment to get to a pretty good answer at something, depending on what you're studying. When in the real world, you have to consider there's a lot of different factors. You're dealing with individual people, you're also dealing with society as a whole, you're dealing with the national, international politics, just what's happening in the world. So you're never going to have that kind of clear cut, perfect way of moving things forward. And I think that's an important lesson I had to learn. But it's, how do we take that and say, what's the best step forward to get to maybe where we want to be, or the next step.
Yeah, I mean, the two things I'm really hearing with that, and from the experience that I got from my undergrad in science is, you're writing that paper. It's like very lengthy. You're really digging into every little aspect of it, making it as long kind of as possible. Versus now you just got to hit the talking points that really have the most weight to it, and then carry with them. Once you talk to them, you don't have to carry those ideas with them later on into the sessions and when they actually make the moves to make the money move around. I'm sure you
Exactly.
worked on a bunch of things with the politics and was still on that topic. Any like big successes you wanted to cover back when you were doing that, or still are you still being active in politics on the?
Yeah,
Or,
I still do quite a bit with it. I think in the US when I was working with that, so I did that as a side kind of throughout graduate school and my postdoc, and I thought it was a really great experience. And I would definitely, all scientists say to do this, because you actually become a better scientist by learning this type of science communication. And it also kind of reminds you of why you got into science, because you're really talking about what's the cool thing, what's the spark. It's very easy to get caught in, this plot isn't working again, and I have to troubleshoot this experiment. But then when you get to say, what is the actual outcome of this, and it's amazing to see what the outcome is, and it's that spark that gets. I mean, that's why people get into science. That's why kids, are excited about seeing a volcano. It's the spark of it. So how do we bring that back? And that really allows you to teaches you to communicate well. So I think it has a lot of positive outcomes just as a scientist and on your work, because you're able to communicate your science better and relate it back to what's the outcome rather than getting stuck in this. In terms of positives that came out of it. We had a lot of success in increasing the budget when I was there. Most science is funded by the government, so you have the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation in the U.S. I mean, every year they get, Congress holds the power of the purse, so they are able to allot money to those institutions every single year. So when I was in that role, we had a lot of success in every year getting an increase in funding. And a lot of that is due to scientists showing up on Capitol Hill, talking about what they do. And again, it's that exciting. It's saying, here's a problem that exists in the world. Here's how it impacts people. Here's how it might cost more money if we don't fix it. Any way to grab that hook. But then you really outline the problem and say, this is how I'm solving it. And this is what we're doing. This is only available because of funding from the government. So we had a lot of success in that. And I think it's really important. I think it's on the scientists to communicate with the public and not the public to learn how to speak science. So I think it's really important that for all aspects of policy, that scientists are able to communicate effectively what they're researching in a way that both policymakers and the public can understand and can engage with.
I'm dealing with that challenge a bit with AI because I mean it's not necessarily people aren't running towards getting educated to it. I definitely can relate in some ways, especially when you're talking about excitement. That's something I'm kind of like digging more into nowadays. Like the excitement that I bring into like my prospects and sales calls, things like
Yeah,
that. It definitely shows and it reflects and it comes back to me often. Sure, it's exactly true for the politics on Capitol Hill. What you're doing now with work in Ireland, and actually, since I didn't really get to bring this up during your little bio, but I know you've done some work in the community trying to help like
yeah,
opportunities in science be more available. So that's like same sort of thing, getting kids excited in science so then they can pursue whether it's a role in science or just knowledge, finding knowledge and
yeah.
searching that out. Yeah, what did you do with the community? I know you have a few projects that you've done just to
Yeah.
science more.
Yeah, so I've done a lot of science outreach, and to me, it's fun. And again, you're connecting back to why you got into science. And I always think my goal when I do any science outreach, it's not to. It's great if somebody learns something, fantastic. But the point is this excitement and that you feel like you can engage with science. It's great if people go on to be a scientist. But what we want is a scientifically literate society, which doesn't mean everybody needs to be a scientist. It's just they feel they can engage with the science system. So whether this is when they go to their physician and ask a question, they feel like they can, whether it's, asking about, well, what's happening with the environment. They feel like they can ask that question. And I mean, our bodies are biology and chemistry and physics. So it's just that basic understanding of that. So I worked in a lot of different science outreach programs, whether it be in New York City. I worked with some fantastic organizations. One is the BioBus, which brings a mobile lab to schools. I was the kind of events coordinator for Brainy, which is a neuroscience organization in New York City, and we would host Brain Awareness Week. I've done art exhibits, and there's been a lot of different ways we approach the public and how to do it. And a big thing I was always passionate about was making it accessible to everybody. I think historically, a lot of science outreach was done by universities. And so it's only the people in those spheres that would show up or that would bring their kids with them. So it's kind of staying within academic circles, and science is for everybody. But you need to learn how to communicate. Again, it's our job to learn how to communicate with different communities. So I've done a lot of different trainings and have run trainings on inclusive science outreach and how do you meet people where they are at, understand where they're coming from and maybe what their concerns are. There's groups that have had really bad experiences with science and medicine. So how do you, effectively reach out to them in order to let them experience, the fun that science can bring, that they feel like they can engage with science. And so nothing is more exciting than, I have done a lot of science clubs and in youth groups, and you start off and all the kids walk in and they're from particular communities and they're just like, oh, science. This isn't for me. I don't want to do this. Like, why are you here? But then by the end of it, we let them run an experiment and we say, it's fine if you mess up. It's fine if you spill. And they work through it and they get to see an outcome of something they did. And it's just like, wow, that was really cool to kind of see that turn. And so I think science outreach is very important, and learning how to be inclusive and to kind of reach all groups, I think is very important to widen the circle of who is a scientist. Because I think anybody could be, but it's just a matter of making sure we can reach everybody.
I just love that everyone can be a scientist because, like, right now with the and I almost hate bringing these things to AI because I'm kind of making these podcasts to get away from AI, but like at the same time, AI is enabling everyone to become a developer of some sort, so they can all make
Yeah,
these computer systems that can just run and do things on their own. And it's like that's a huge power that if you're not going to access and realize, it's such a huge, huge miss, huge loss, huge handicap actually going into the future. I want to shout out two of those organizations. You mentioned BioBus. That was a really cool. You introduced me to BioBus. Really cool idea. So if, just to introduce it, I mean, they got a whole bus and just decked it out, just teched it out with all the science and labs, microscopes, all the little equipment, so you could just take it to a underprivileged area and do science there and show them what what's here, give them those opportunities. And also GenSpace, that was a neat organization to get
yeah,
introduced to. A little less, I guess, targeting underprivileged or harder access, but still giving science more to the community to make it more accessible so they can do their own research if they have some idea. It's like a community lab space that's almost like
yeah.
a work for labs, I think, kind of sounded
It's a
like.
fantastic group. Yeah,
But
yeah, and I think the community is really important. I mentioned I had an art exhibit that I worked in collaboration with Art Tech House and Society for Neuroscience, and we had an exhibit. It was called Life of a Neuron. It was one of the coolest projects I worked on, so people could go. And it's this immersive audiovisual experience. And it was based on a real neuron that was taken during surgery from a human. It was their prefrontal cortex neuron. And so we developed the story of life and shows you what happens in your brain in a very, we worked with fantastic artists that could make it come to life, all of the science. So I would communicate what was happening in the brain. It's very jargony terms into something that they would make into these amazing exhibits. You see everything from birth to death. And I think being able to see that experience through the lens of a neuron in your brain, it was really a way for people to not only feel something, because science is creative, science is emotional at times. Like we're trying to solve things that afflict people. But I think it also gives people a sense of we're a lot more alike than we're different. And when we're in a very divisive world, but then we see ourselves are all responding, the same way to something and we all have these same key experiences. It's also a way to bring kind of that collective community sense in, whether it be through community science or through letting everybody experience this, kind of emotional thing about what our bodies can do. And it's amazing together. So I think there's a lot that can be said from engaging in any type of science outreach.
100%. Definitely agree. Well, I'm about to, probably get into my own sort of excitement here. One of the reasons I want to get you on is to talk about your research as well, because it kind of does deal with, the brain, especially those sort of, those neural pathways that we do all kind of share, then even though we don't feel like it sometimes.
Yeah.
And I do also want to thank you for giving me the opportunity, or I guess giving me the great excuse to go read some scientific literature for the first time in probably years. So I got to read your research with you and Dr. Julie Miwa. So it was pretty neat to read her research as well, because I did catch up with her thanks to your referral from you. She's done some awesome research, gave me kind of, I think, a high level idea of what you're doing, which I'm going to have you talk about as well.
Mhm.
Yeah. So anyway, for kind of the general audience, like, how would you explain the high level idea of your research that was in response to, like, anxiety stressors, like the pathway, one of the pathways you studied to how we adapt to those anxieties and experiences? I think it was the Lynx protein and what, a TRVP or
Exactly.
something. Not that you have to get into the protein names. I don't think we want to get there,
Yeah,
but
yeah. Yeah, you described it really well. A big question that I was always interested in is why is it that a whole group of people can experience the exact same stressor? Some are fine. You have a normal stress response. I mean, stress is good, it motivates us. But we want it to be, you go up and then you go down. So, why is it that, some people just have that normal response? They experience a stressor, they go through something stressful, but then they return to their baseline functioning. But then others might go on to develop something like depression and anxiety. So, what is different between those two individuals? How can we understand that in order to help those that develop something like anxiety and depression, but also to understand the greater concepts of stress susceptibility and, importantly, stress resiliency? Because then we can find ways that we can target not just susceptibility, but resiliency pathways. So that's the crux of what I studied. So yeah, as a grad student, I studied this from the genetics perspective. So is there something in our genes that might predispose us to being more stress susceptible? And then when I was a postdoc, I studied this from a neurocircuitry perspective. So is there something different about the way our brain talks to itself? So you have all these super highways and connections in your brain. Is there a different way that the brains communicate within itself between individuals that are susceptible and resilient? And then how can we harness the power of those understandings, as I said, to help those suffering with anxiety and depression, but also to understand, the human power of resiliency, which is something I think everybody can harness, no matter what you're doing in life, no matter where you're at. That concept of resiliency can be really important. And so, how do we understand that beyond the buzzword of resiliency? What does it actually mean to be resilient
mm.
in your brain?
So what, well, obviously you had multiple experiments, but maybe some like the most pivotal ones, I guess, for the research. Can you like mention some like the procedure of that? Like what did you do and what did they kind of prove or at least, support? Like you were using
Yeah,
knockout like, different types of stress. Like what were the
we
conditions?
do. So, as a graduate student from the genetic perspective, part of my research was in rodent models because we can do a lot of manipulations in the rodent model and the different behavioral experiments. And then part of it was also in humans. So, then how do we connect the findings that are being discovered in the rodent model to the human condition so we can have this pathway where we're discussing the results. So we would use knockout mice. So we can manipulate the genome of mice to essentially remove a whole gene so we can see what happens to development, to behavior as a gene is missing. So I studied what was called the Lynx gene. So it's part of a family of Lynx genes. They are cholinergic modulators. So the cholinergic system is this widespread neurotransmitter system in your brain. And it acts as a modulator. So it can kind of increase or decrease. And it has tons of functions. It's involved in everything from emotional regulation to learning and memory to movement. What it's doing all depends on what part of the brain is being activated at that time. And it's a really cool system. I'm gonna say cool, but it has all these different types of receptors that can also do different things. So it gets very intricate, but it's a very important system because it can just modulate everything throughout the brain. And so, what the Lynx protein does is it essentially modulates these receptors. So, it acts as a brake. And so, when it's present, it could say, we need to kind of simmer this down a bit. And so, when they were discovered, so my mentor, Dr. Julie Miwa, discovered this family. And a lot of the first studies were done on Lynx 1, which is involved in learning and memory. And it was known that Lynx 2, there was a study done before I joined in different laboratories that created the knockout mouse. So that was where we just removed the links 2 gene. It was found that these mice have higher anxiety like behavior. So while we can't say a mouse has anxiety, I can't ask a mouse, how are you feeling? But we can do different tests to kind of get at anxiety. And so we call it anxiety like behavior. So for instance, a mice, if you think about evolutionary, they should feel more comfortable kind of in the dark because their predators come from above. So if they're out in the open, that's going to be, our human minds would say, more anxiety producing. But if they're in the dark, so we can run tests like such as the light dark box. So if you put a mouse in a box, where do they go? So the Lynx 2 mice, for instance, they go into the dark a lot faster and they stay there a lot longer. When mice that have the Lynx 2 gene, they'll go in the dark and then they'll come out and they'll do this kind of normal exploring. So we can do a lot of these tests, say, okay, well, we think this is impacting, the behaviors around anxiety. So then I would run a various experiments to see, well, what is actually happening in the brain? How are these interacting with the receptors? And that gets us at really the function. And so can we connect maybe how a particular receptor is working to cause that behavior? And that's when we can then start targeting that receptor, say, for an individual that has anxiety. And so then to connect this to humans, we give humans, there's all these tests you can give to get at anxiety levels, whether you reach a clinical threshold. And I could test your DNA. So we would collect saliva, we would isolate the links to gene, and we would sequence it. So that's the fancy word for just reading what the gene says. So just like reading a book, you can read DNA, and it has the system where basically every 3 letters, you're sticking with the analogy of reading equals a word, and then all of these words form together to make the functional protein. And so what we did was we said, do some humans have differences in the links 2 gene naturally? And then can we correlate that to any differences in their anxiety levels? And it turns out there was. So we found that there are humans that have naturally occurring mutations in their links 2 gene, and that these individuals do have clinical levels of anxiety. So this is saying that the mechanisms that we're discovering in these things to knockout mice are likely happening in the human brain of these individuals. So this is an end all be all for everybody with anxiety. It's an extremely complex, multifactorial. But for some individuals, kind of a root cause could be a mutation in this gene. And so further studies on the line can say, okay, we can have a targeted approach to treatment where we might target these receptors along with a talk therapy to help people move forward quicker since we're getting at that biological root cause.
So you can target the cause rather than just like the treatment, I guess, with I guess traditional therapies or at least the accepted ones, working towards new ones anyway.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, therapies it works really, really well. But if you think of, even if you look at the diagnostic,
The more tools you have in your arsenal is always the better, right?
is always a better. I mean, if you look at depression, I think you have to have 5 of, I forget the exact numbers. I haven't been in this in a while, but say it's 5 out of 25 symptoms. So if you imagine you have a room full of people all diagnosed, they could all have different symptoms,
Yeah.
because if you have to have 5, the more targeted you can get, as you said, your arsenal becomes
Mm.
a lot easier. Because otherwise you're just catching this umbrella, and then trying to find what works. But if you can get more targeted, which is what a lot of cancer research has done, it used to be breast cancer, but now you can target it down to different types of receptors. And so I view it's just this more personalized medicine, and it takes a long time to get there, and the brain's very difficult to study because it's
That's interesting.
there.
Yeah.
But how you got to keep moving the step forward to understanding.
It kind of looks like small steps because you talk about this one little, synapse, one little protein, one little strand of DNA versus still got the whole other thing of what's going on. Yeah. So like the overall effect, then one of those like practical aspects of it. Can we like use that protein, use that the links when it's normally functioning, I suppose, to help us better adapt to like when we can kind of feel like it's on. I guess that anxiety is high. Like, what is the from your research and what you've done? Like, what is the next best move you should do when everything's functioning normally? When you feel that um, high anxiety, I think you actually
Yeah.
called it. Actually, no, you did call it adaptability, but you eventually mentioned in some of the research fear extinction. It's almost
Mhm.
like acquired taste in a way. Like this thing starts off like being rough or you don't like it. It's kind of hard, but like after a while, it's like this is nice. So I think one of these tests actually used capsaicin, so like they would start to feel the spice and want to like it, but over time, what subsides and they end up liking it. Kind of that'd be the fear extinction. But that played into this whole thing as well. So it's like a loaded question, but like, what's the practical ways that we can use high anxiety to, I guess, get rid of fears?
Well, yeah, that's a very different. They don't exactly correlate to those, but I think of more in my postdoc research in neural circuitry for this step, about what's the practical side. And I think there's a lot of power in the outcomes from that. So we were studying generally stress susceptibility and resiliency. And so I was studying this from a social aspect. We have bullying models that we can use. And so why is it that some mice, after they go through a bullying experience, retreat and others are fine. They maintain their social interactions. And the discoveries that were made, and this is not just my research, it's across the field. It's this idea that susceptibility and resiliency are not two sides of a coin. They're two distinct pathways. And I think there's a lot of power in that. Just because you have high stress susceptibility doesn't mean that your resiliency is super low because they're not two sides of a coin. They're separate mechanisms. So we discovered that they are different pathways within the brain. It's not that one goes up and one goes down in this system. Now they do interact with each other and they involve a lot of the same brain regions, of course, but there's a lot of power in the fact that you can develop your resiliency even if you're in high susceptibility, because it is a very unique pathway. And our brains are plastic. And this is the neuroscience term for meaning they can change. So, of course, we're a lot more plastic when we're young. Think about how quick kids learn a language. That's because our brains are very plastic and they do kind of harden up over time. That's very quickly a term for it. But it is harder to learn language, as an adult. But it's not that it's impossible. And I think the important and really empowering thing out of that research is you can build your resiliency no matter where you are, whether you have high stress susceptibility or low, and whether you have really active stress systems going on all the time. I mean, it could be that the amygdala is a big part of the brain that's involved in kind of stress and anxiety. It could be that your amygdala is sending out signals to your whole brain and is just screaming constantly. But what's kind of a really cool part is that you can still develop resiliency even if it's doing that, and it can maintain that. So you have the power to build that, and the resiliency can eventually hamper that down. But nobody is unable to do that, and that could be through seeing a physician, through talk therapy, but it could also be through things of yoga, meditation, exercise. Doing something that you really like is a way to build that resiliency pathways. And I've always found kind of power in that because I could be going through something really stressful, but it's like, okay, I can actually turn on my resiliency circuits. And it could be by exercising, or something. And it doesn't get rid of, that anxiety and depression, but I know that I'm harnessing that resiliency, which can help you. So it may feel, an individual could feel like they're really lost, but I think you have power to increase your resiliency even in that. And our brains can do that, which is amazing. It's not that you have to have one or the other. So I think that's a really powerful outcome of that research.
Oh yeah, so you can continue forward even if you have some anxiety, effects going on. I mean, you're going to have those anxieties. It just happens. It's kind of part of life in a way. Gets you out of trouble too sometimes too. So you should have it. You don't want to, but you can't like not
Very
move forward
important.
through
Yeah.
life. Yeah, that's interesting. So the fear extinction and the doctors is more about the resiliency, or is that more to lowering anxiety?
Fear extinction is a model. It's not a perfect thing for more of PTSD. So you think of PTSD as you experience, it could be, say, a loud noise in a very stressful situation. And so then, even when you're in a safe situation and you hear that noise, you have that same stress and anxiety response as if you're in that original stressful situation. So, and then fear extinction is when you have exposure to that loud sound continually in a safe environment. Eventually you don't have that same response, that really stressful response to there. So fear extinction refers to that process of you keep hearing that sound that initially caused all of this fear, but eventually you can extinguish it where you can hear it without having that stressful response. And there are kind of unique pathways within the brain to develop fear extinction. And again, that's kind of like stress susceptibility and resiliency, where it's not two sides of a coin, they're different pathways. So while you always have that connection of like sound, fear, no matter what it is. But you develop these safety pathways, and eventually they can become stronger than the fear. And so then, and when you hear the sound, your safety pathways are what are activated, and you no longer have that same stressful response. And then, of course, it can come back because that fear is always there, and they connect to each other. But that's like a powerful way. So there are like exposure therapies that take place, and so fear extinction is really a model of that, where we can study what happens in the brain when somebody hears. I'm using sound, but it could be anything, this trigger over and over again in a safe environment. Can we essentially train our brain, and then particularly what pathways are coming online during that maybe can be targeted to help individuals coping with something like post-traumatic stress syndrome. And so in this case, I'd say you always would have to connect it to an exposure therapy, but are there ways that we can harness the power of neuroscience to maybe target those safety pathways or quiet those fear pathways to help the individual along their healing journey faster?
Now, did that kind of share some of the same, like, I guess, strategies you could maybe say for the resiliency or raising resiliency in your research? Like you're saying, kind of do an exposure, then take yourself away from it for a little bit, then come back, like kind of that on off. That was how you were growing resiliency, or at least saw it grow.
There are
Maybe that.
there are connections, so there are learning pathways involved, within both. Your brain has to undergo, classical learning. So this is where the pathways become stronger over time. For instance, when you're learning, those safety mechanisms that loud sound does not equal danger, you are learning, and there is some unlearning that takes place as well in the really fearful one. I'd say for resiliency, it is going through some of these strengthening pathways. So you're strengthening that resiliency pathway over time, which is going through a lot of the same mechanisms as you would be when you're kind of learning this safety mechanism. I think the key difference is that these two behaviors, whether it be stress resiliency in general versus a very particular trauma. So if you think of it as a sound, you have to bring in the parts of the brain that are involved in sound memory. So there are different pathways that are taking place for something like a fear extinction and a resiliency, but the neural processes that take place are very similar. It's just happening in different parts of the brain, possibly with different types of circuits, so like different flavors, different chemicals involved. But the core kind of processes is you're forging new pathways in your brain to do something, and our brains are powerful enough to do that. We're not stuck in the same way. So I think in both of those we are really finding a way to really get down in the trenches and build something new. So I always give the example. I think Inside Out is actually a very good example, the cartoon movie of neuroscience and what can happen in the brain. So just like in Inside Out, all the characters are constantly talking to each other. Our brain is constant, all the different areas are talking to itself. And you can see how they work together, and they need each other to bring forward an outcome. And sometimes they can do one path and it leads to one way, but you can get to the same a different way. But they pop up memories, they bring them down in our brain. It is doing that as we experience the world. It forges kind of these different pathways and things to focus on. So it is a lot of what we're focusing on does make a difference. And, I say that with that not everybody has the ability to focus on something like resiliency. There are a lot of socioeconomic factors, involved in access to care and, other things involved in this, but that power is very similar in both.
Yeah, it's pretty. So I mean, you can definitely train your system. Biggest
Yeah.
take out of this,
You're
it's
not
not
stuck.
stuff. Yeah, yeah, that's pretty great. I'm definitely doing a lot of that. I know a lot of entrepreneurs are doing that because we're constantly learning a ton of things. We're constantly putting ourselves into high anxiety situations, to say the
Yeah.
least.
Yeah.
Over time, yeah, they just start to get a little less anxiety. Like, you're my fifth podcast, and I can tell you the emotions I had for my first one are just much less. They're still around for this one, but there's much less and much more dealable, I guess, to deal withable now.
Yeah, you learn you're safe. It's part of
Yeah.
we have our prefrontal cortex has 2 regions to it, and they're essentially diametrically opposed. One region kind of reinforces your brain to be anxious, but the other one is just like chill out, man. And so you can actually strengthen that chill out, man one through these processes. So you still have the anxiety, but your prefrontal cortex and that part of it is able to really say, "Hey, this this is anxiety, but like we've done this before. We'll be okay." But it talks to itself through this process, and then you're able to show up a little bit better, each time and learn through it.
So just do tough things, huh?
That's it. Yeah.
Well, so obviously now you're a little more working in education with the Erasmus program. Has this been playing? Have you been able to use your research to help out students that may be experiencing their own stress? Has that been able to have a nice parallel?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not certified, to be doing that, but we do run some sessions, and this is me talking as an individual, not on behalf of the university. But I do run some sessions where we just do a very brief, talking about what it means to go into a new environment because we're enabling students to be mobile. We think that's a very important part of their education is you go to a different country. You learn a different country's system. You learn about different ways of doing things, and you particularly in Erasmus, it's upholding certain European values and really learning about European education systems, European democracy, and inclusion, and diversity, support. And it's really important that we think that students get this experience. I still think the most intense mode of learning is traveling and being thrown into a different seeing something done differently than you've known is really eye opening and expanding and humbles you, but also you learn a lot about the human experience. And so that's what the Erasmus program is. It's to enable people to be mobile and to do some of their studies somewhere else to gain something. And so it's just, so when we run these sessions, it's a lot of times students haven't spent this long, away from home, outside the country in a different place. So we do run a session where we introduce things of, we don't say the terms resiliency, but we talk about what you might be feeling, when you go somewhere different and experience that intense loneliness, the first time or the first time you say something wrong. And I always give a joke about what when I moved to Ireland, English is the main, Irish and English are spoken here. But the English is still different than English in the US. And I always give the example of I was in, a group meeting and I just asked where the garbage can was and everybody started hysterically laughing at me because you wouldn't say garbage can here. It's just the bin. And in my head, my stress must have spiked. I went through this like 30 seconds of, oh my God, I don't belong here. What am I doing? I can't know this. And then it was like, okay, I passed it in there. And so we talk about these experiences and while not going into what's happening in the brain, it's saying it's normal, to feel these things. It's normal to be more stressed at different sounds and different foods. It's just different ways of doing things. And for the most part, it will pass. And it's this idea of just letting people know that it's normal. Experience it. You're going to be uncomfortable for a bit, but you'll come out more resilient in the end. And then, of course, highlighting that if you're not, that's also okay. And then there's resources to help you through it. So I think there is a little bit of it in there, and then helping students on that side. And then, the other side of it is using my experience just with data. How can I use all of the data that's just collected on the program to use evidence to solve problems, to move the program forward in a more effective way by, having a data driven approach. And so I think any company, regardless of what you're doing, can also harness that side of science, which is saying, rather than us thinking, this is a problem that can work, what does the data say? And then that just leads to more efficiency and more effective outcomes for all stakeholders involved, whether it be the workers or the people involved in the services.
Yeah, even though you're not necessarily talking about the science as much, and I feel like that's going to help you with the confidence of what you're talking about because you could have that level, you could go to
Yeah.
that extent with it. Not that
Yeah.
you don't need to. So it's like that you know what you're talking about in a way. Um, so since you mentioned that garbage can thing, I bet you're probably the only one that actually remembers that story that actually even happened. You know what I mean?
I think
So
that's a really important takeaway.
yeah, so
Just that,
it's huge to
yeah.
you, but everyone else just like okay, we're going to go on with the rest of our day now.
And I think that's a really important outcome,
Yeah.
just to remember that, things are your brain remembers that. I mean, we're biologically wired to remember these things. When cortisol comes online, our learning pathways to an extent. Now, if you have too much cortisol, your learning goes down. But that that spike in cortisol is meant to help you learn faster and to make that memory more salient. And you think of evolutionary, that makes sense. If you eat a berry that makes you sick, you can't keep eating that berry. You need to learn really fast that this berry is making you sick. So that spike in cortisol helps you to learn more effectively. So you think about you're going through something embarrassing, evolutionary wise, your body sees that as the same as walking in front of a lion or eating a poisoned berry. So it's meant to be like we need to learn this really fast, in order to
That's
survive.
really interesting,
Um,
actually. I mean, one of the again, I hate bringing this stuff to AI, but I need to sometimes. One of the things that AI is trying to do is like, how can you have it learn something quicker sometimes when it's a really big miss versus the
yeah,
small. incremental learns that it's currently, doing. And yeah, maybe some sort of AI cortisol system might be what's needed.
Yeah, so you need that sweet spot. If you get too much, it hinders your ability to learn. So it's what's that sweet spot of stress that we all need in order to kind of be at the best performance level. Too much or too little is not good. And that really goes back to the cholinergic system. It works on this like curve. So it's the Goldilocks. You have to have just the right amount. You can't have too much
Does that
or
amount move
too little.
sometimes, or like amongst one person's life, can it be trained to move or be?
It can, yeah, definitely. It can kind of shift based off of life, experiences and different exposures. I mean, the cholinergic system is involving nicotinic receptors. So those that are smoking cigarettes, introducing to nicotine, you change the composition and the way your receptors respond. So you are shifting things, in that sense. But it can just be experience. Our brains are super. The brain is an amazing organ, constantly adapting to what's happening. So it's increasing receptors, decreasing. So, well, for the most part, it's, kind of steady, especially when we're an adult, our brain's trying to protect itself. Things can shift, based off of outside.
Oh yeah, last question I want to ask you, and then I'll let you get back to educating young minds and doing what you're doing today. Um, any like cool success stories or from either yourself, from you when you're doing traveling, or from the school of the Erasmus program? I know it's got to be generalized in some regard, but I'm just sure there's a lot of cool experiences that they've either had as some of the students you've worked with, or even you yourself, because I know you've done some traveling yourself. I think you took advantage of some programs that are similar to this in the states. So yeah, just kind of talk to the benefits, firsthand experience benefits of that type of program, mobility in school.
Yeah, I think it is. Well, there are more statistics and data on how this enhances employability and enhances these very particular skills. I think the more important things that this can bring is those soft skills that we would say. So it is, I think, developing resiliency, it's developing communication, intercultural communication, and we live in an international world. And so it's the ability to communicate and talk with other people.
Were there any programs or activities that you or your students did that like really displayed that in real life time?
There are some really cool
Or
kind of collaborations that take place that will look at a very particular issue. So things like the media and democracy. So you have this big overarching problem, that we have. How do we bring together people of different disciplines to kind of talk through a problem? Or how do we see something that maybe has happened in the past and view it through different lenses to bring about a new understanding or a new change. Because I think talking through with different people that have a different perspective of you, and that's done in science, but particularly, especially when you're working with people in different countries, you all have a different perspective. Everybody's had a different upbringing. So everybody then brings something different to the table. And so there's so many different kind of success stories, particularly for programs where people are targeting one issue. So whether it be sustainability in the workplace, what are concrete ways we can address it, or how do we enhance digitalization, of processes that we can work together by combining various expertise. And I think it's just really powerful, for the individual and for companies in developing to get these different kind of diverse thoughts at the table. Just in my mind, kind of makes you more resilient and a person to kind of see things from
yeah.
different people's
Actually,
views.
my last guest kind of said sort of something similar, like getting new board members onto your company. You want to have these different thoughts, even if they're kind of trying to the way you operate. That actually makes your
Yeah,
company resilient because you have this different viewpoint.
it
So that's
does.
kind of what
Yeah.
happens. Like these Erasmus programs throughout the EU will join together. Like the University of Galway has a bunch of people from a bunch of different schools that will kind of come into a little circle conversation about what they're working on and get to share their viewpoints.
The crux of it is students are mobile, so they could take a semester or a year abroad, and then the courses they take count towards their degree at home. So it's kind of a exchange of students. So within the same program, two will go out, kind of two can go in. They'll be immersed in the school and there, and that's the main form. So it's really a study abroad. But there are a lot of new programs that come out of it, such as blended programs. And these can be like a short term module. And these are ones that are really about a particular issue. It's a really cool course names. I mean, there's been some even on like neuroscience and video games that I want to partake in that are really cool. But a lot of these are these short term ones are really interdisciplinary, and they're really saying what are some issues and what are ways we can bring together interdisciplinary folks together to address it, in a different way. And I think that helps everybody because it's very easy to get stuck, in your own way of thinking. And we all have different strengths. So, like your kind of boardroom example, if you have five really good people, in the boardroom, and they all know how to handle these 10 scenarios really well between them. But then all of a sudden, this 11th scenario comes in, having that diverse perspective, there, maybe that's a person who knows how to deal with that situation better. It only makes things stronger. And then you also, like I said, helping to learn those soft skills, like communication. I think really powerful for everybody.
Yeah, communication definitely in different areas, different strange lands and such. Because like I
Yeah.
said, that is high anxiety, and when you have that high anxiety, you're gonna hide under the rock. You're gonna go into that black box, and you're not gonna talk and say the things that you need to say to share your opinion that makes the group resilient. Well, I do want to thank you again for your time. This was awesome. I learned a lot. And definitely some things I can definitely put into practice. I think too, and I now know that I know a little more about my own anxieties and build my own resilience. Thank you
Yeah.
for sharing your knowledge, sharing that research, because I know wasn't easy to do. A lot of hours must have been in that lab. A lot of late
Yes.
nights writing those papers after reading them too. That's so. Thanks for getting started with what you've been doing, Kristen. Thanks for coming on here.
Oh, thanks for having me. Just remember when you're stressed, you say, hey, resiliency, come online. And yeah, it's just something you can constantly strengthen. I
Definitely will
always
train my
do that.
resiliency.
Yeah. Well, so thanks for having me.